chimpanzee greeting. Basically, it says, this is me, this is Jane. And after making a call like that, the chimpanzee will usually listen. And these calls are very important because every chimpanzee has his or her own individual call. So that you hear that sound and you know exactly which chimpanzee is calling. And this is important because the chimpanzees don't travel around in a troop or group like your monkeys, for example, like gorillas, but they can travel around by themselves or in small groups. The only stable group is a mother and her dependent young. That's a young up to the age of about 7 years. And sometimes many of these small groups join in a big excited gathering when there's a delicious food around. So they're always, it's called a fusion fishing society. And so it's very important for the individuals within a community of about 50 to keep track of where the other members are. Well, let me go back to the beginning. I don't think I would be standing here if I hadn't been born into a family with an amazing mother, and that's just luck. I could have been born to any mother, but I wasn't. I had an extraordinary mother. I loved animals when I was a very small little girl. Probably some of you here have always loved animals too. And my mother was always supportive. So the famous story is how when I was 5 years old, we went from London, the city where we lived, to have a 2-week holiday on a farm in the country. And oh, it was so exciting. I can still remember cows, pigs, horses face to face. And I was given a job to help collect the hens' eggs. And so I was putting these eggs into my little basket. There were no cruel battery farms back then. Hens pecked around in the farmyard. They were supposed to lay their eggs in these little wooden hen houses, probably about this tall, maybe a little taller. And they also slept there at night. So I was putting these eggs into my little basket every day, but you know, there's the egg. So where was the hole big enough for the egg to come out? I apparently was asking everybody and nobody told me to my satisfaction. So I decided I would have to find out for myself. What I remember clearly is seeing a hen, and she was going up this little, like a gangplank into the hen house, because they also slept there at night, and that gangplank was closed to stop the foxes getting them. And thinking, she's going to lay an egg, and crawling after her. Well, this was a big mistake. And I suppose with squawks of fear, the hen flew out. So remember, I'm only 5, but I thought to myself, no hen will lay an egg here. This is a frightening place. And so I left the hen house and went into an empty one. I think there were about 6 of them. And waited, and waited, and waited. Which was fine for me, but my poor family didn't know where I was. And you can imagine my mother getting a bit desperate, and you know, it's getting towards dusk. And suddenly she sees this excited little girl rushing towards the house. She could so easily have grabbed me and said, "How dare you go off without telling us? Don't you dare do it again," which would have killed the excitement. The reason I tell this story is because if you look with hindsight, isn't that the making of a little scientist? There's the curiosity, asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, and learning patience. It was all there. And if I'd had a different sort of mother, all of that early curiosity might have been crushed. And that's why I say I might not be standing here. She found books for me to read when I was a child about animals because she thought, well, if I find Jane books about animals, she'll learn to read more quickly, and of course that was true. Dr. Dolittle. Some of you must have read Dr. Dolittle, that amazing country doctor who left his lucrative practice to treat animals and who learned animal language, or was taught rather, by his parrot, Polynesia. She taught him all the languages of all the animals. And actually, if you have a copy of that, go and read how she taught him, because that actually is the fundamental basis of ethology. Watch the animal, see how the tail wags, see the situation. He wags his tail, look for the cocked ear. It was all there. At any rate, I desperately wanted a parrot. so that I could learn the animal languages too. And of course we now know that it's the pet trade in parrots that is causing many species to become almost extinct, that along with habitat destruction. But in those days, you know, we didn't think like that. We didn't need to think like that. The animals were not becoming extinct back then. So when I was 10 years old, I found a little book in a second-hand bookshop. It had to be second-hand. We had very little money. World War II was raging across Europe. My father was off fighting in the war, and we'd gone to live with my mother's mother. So we had tiny bits of pocket money. You know, we couldn't even afford a bicycle. But my sister and I were given, I don't know, a couple of pennies a week, and I used to save mine up. And what I loved was this second-hand bookshop. We certainly couldn't afford a new book, and most of my books came from a library. But this second-hand bookshop, the old man who ran it, he didn't know where the books were. They were piled higgledy-piggledy all over the floor, and you could get a book very cheaply. And I found this little book, and I just had saved up enough money to buy it, and it was called Tarzan of the Apes. I took it home, climbed my favourite tree in the garden, and read the book from cover to cover, and read it again, and probably read it again. And of course, I fell passionately in love with Tarzan's glorious Lord of the Forest. And what did Tarzan do? He married the wrong Jane. Anyway, that was where my dream began. I will grow up, go to Africa, live with animals, and write books about them. I didn't want to be a scientist. I wanted to be like a naturalist, an explorer. But everybody laughed at me. How would I get to Africa? In those days, it was the dark continent. There were no planes going back and forth with tourists as there are today. We didn't have any money, the war was raging, and I was just a girl. Girls didn't have those opportunities back then, and we're going back 70 years now from now. And so, Jane, why don't you dream about something you can achieve and forget this nonsense about Africa? But not my mother. She would say, perhaps not in these words, but the whole message, if you really want something, you're going to have to work really hard and take advantage of opportunity, and above all, never give up. And so, when I left school, there was no money for university, and again, it was my mother who said, well, we've got enough money for secretarial course, do that, and then maybe you get a job in Africa. I was working at a job in London, and I got a letter from a school friend whose parents had moved to Kenya, and she invited me for a holiday. Yeah, opportunity, right? There's the opportunity. So I couldn't save up money working in London. I went home, and I worked as a waitress. It was really tough. It wasn't one of these fancy hotels where people drop in for a romantic dinner or a business lunch. It was a place where people went, not long after the war, they'd saved up, and they came for a whole week's holiday. So you had to be really nice to them for a whole week to get even a reasonable tip. But of course, I made sure they all knew I was saving up to go to Africa. Eventually, I had enough money. And that first trip, you know, today, people mostly get on an aeroplane, so you start in one country, you start in Singapore, and you might end up in somewhere in Africa or Latin America or wherever. And you're just there, one place, and then overnight you're somewhere else. But I went by boat because it was cheaper back then. And I can never forget the magic of that first voyage where the dark, grey seas of Europe gradually got warmer, and the smells, the scents coming from shore, if we were close enough, became more exotic, and the first flying fish, and the first dolphins playing around the boat, just magic. And I got to Kenya eventually, and stayed with my friend, and the very first night, they woke me up in the morning and said, come and look, and there was a huge leopard paw mark just outside my window. That was exciting. And then after a bit, somebody said, well, Jane, if you're interested in animals, you should meet Louis Leakey. Louis Leakey spent his life searching for the fossilized remains of early man. And he also was very fascinated in evolution. The modern animals tracing it back to their early forebears in the prehistoric world. And he was head of the Natural History Museum, so I went to see him just to talk about animals. And he asked me so many questions about all the different animals that were there. And because I'd gone on reading books, because I'd spent hours in the Natural History Museum in London, I could answer most of his questions. If I couldn't answer the question, I knew enough to kind of guess. I did quite well. At any rate, I left with a job. I didn't go for a job, but I left as his secretary, really, secretary assistant. It put me right there in the middle of so much exciting new information, with people coming in with carefully preserved specimens of this, that, and the other from different parts of Kenya. And he then allowed me and the one other young English girl who was there to go with himself and his wife, and I think 6 Kenyans, on an annual expedition to a place that's now very, very famous if you know anything about paleontology. And it's Olduvai Gorge, because many human fossils have been found there that fill in gaps in our understanding of our own evolutionary history. But back then, no human remains had been found. Only the other animals that roamed the plains back then, the giant pigs and the giant this, that, and the other. And so it was unknown. There wasn't even a trail leading to it, let alone a road, nothing. And all the animals were there back then. And so every evening after the hard day's work, chipping away at the rock looking for fossils, Julian and I were allowed out on the plains. And giraffes and antelope, a little dig, and once we saw a jackal, once we saw a hyena, we certainly heard them at night. Then there was the day when a rhino trotted back and forth about as far away as the wall over here, and luckily their eyesight isn't very good. He knew something was coming, but the wind was blowing from him to us, so he trotted off in the other direction. And then there was the evening when a young male lion, about 2 years old, fully grown, with bits of mane sprouting on his shoulders, curious as a domestic cat, what were these 2 strange white creatures doing out in his area? And he followed us, probably twice the length of this auditorium, which was a bit scary. It was also extremely exciting. And I think it was that night around the campfire that Lewis decided I was the person he'd been looking for to go and try and learn about our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees. And of course I said yes. And of course it was difficult to find the money, and I had no degree. I was straight from England. In fact, I had to go back home and learn what I could from books about chimpanzees, which is almost nothing, while he tried to find money, and eventually money for 6 months from a rich American businessman. And then, in those days, what's Tanzania today was Tanganyika, was part of the crumbling British Empire. And the authorities were not prepared to take responsibility for this young girl. And they said, no, she can't. We won't have her. It's possibly dangerous. But in the end, Louis Leakey never gave up. They said, oh, all right, but she must have a companion. So who volunteered to come? That same amazing mother. I had money for 6 months. She came for 4 months. We were an expedition on a shoestring. We had a couple of tin plates and tin mugs and a few cans of food. And we had an old ex-army tent that we shared. No nice sewn-in ground sheet and nice zipped-up mosquito flaps on the windows. No. The ground sheet was a piece of canvas on the floor, and if you wanted air to come in, you rolled up the side flaps and tied them with tape. And yes, the air came in, but so too the spiders, the centipedes, and the snakes, which didn't bother me, but my poor mother. And people have said, oh, Jane, you were so brave to go off into the forest. I wasn't brave, it was my dream come true. But for her, and I'd happily go off before it was light and leave her there. She was there all day on her own, except for our cook. And he had an unfortunate love of alcohol. He'd been cook to the various district commissioners who lived in a nearby town, and they thought he'd be ideal for Mum and me. Really good cook, no alcohol for him to get hold of there, but they were wrong. There was the local, very, very potent brew made of fermented bananas. So very often, Mom's only companion all day was a slightly inebriated tonic. What she did for me was two things. One, she started a little clinic with very simple medications that her brother had given us, because he was a doctor. Just aspirins and band-aids and bandages, that sort of thing, Epsom salts and so forth. And she began to treat the fishermen, and she spent hours with each one. So although she wasn't a doctor or a nurse, she made some amazing cures. And she actually, we learned later, she became known as the White Witch Doctor. She started me off with a wonderful relationship with the local people, and that was just amazing. Secondly, in those early days, the chimpanzees ran away as soon as they saw me. And, you know, I was in my dream world. The forest at Crombie is beautiful. But I knew if I didn't see something really exciting before the money ran out, that would be the end, and I would have let Louis Leakey down. So it was great that in the evening when I got down depressed, she would be saying, "But Jane, you found that peak, you're sitting up there, you've got your binoculars, you've seen how the chimps move around in these small changing groups, you're learning how they bend over branches in the trees at night and make a sleeping platform or nest. You're learning about the things they eat, you're learning more than you think." And it was very sad that she left before the breakthrough observation, which you all know about now, but I can never forget the day when, looking through the vegetation, I saw a black chimpanzee hand reach out and break off a grass stem and push it down into the termite mound and pick off the termites that were clinging on with their mandibles. And I saw this hand pick a leafy twig and strip the leaves in order to modify that twig so that it could be used as a tool. These days we wouldn't think anything of it, but back then it was thought that humans and only humans used and made tools. We were defined as man the toolmaker. And so that was the observation that brought in the National Geographic Society with money for me to carry on with the study. And the chimpanzee who demonstrated tool using, and subsequently the fact that chimpanzees sometimes hunt and eat meat, not very often, but sometimes, was the first chimpanzee who began to lose his fear of me, whom I named David Greybeard. We don't know why, but all the chimps have their different personalities, just like we do. Some are brave, some are more timid. And so David Greybeard, as he got more and more familiar, came to my camp, found some bananas, and when I found a group in the forest, they were ready to run as usual, but if David was there, you'd see them looking from him to me and back and thinking, "Oh, she can't be so scary after all." And so in a way it was as though he introduced me to his friends in the forest. And I met with Mike and Goliath. Goliath, who at that time was David's close companion and the top-ranking or alpha male. And old Flo, the matriarch, at least 50 years old, with her teeth worn down to the gums, but a fantastic mother, with a large family. And it turns out that in chimp society, as in human society, there are good mothers and bad mothers. And the good mothers are affectionate and playful, but above all supportive. And it's the supportive mothers whose young ones do better. The males tend to reach a higher position in this constant battle for top rank, and the females are better mothers, more successful. So Flo's children had the same sort of start in life that I had with my supportive mother. Over the years, it became very apparent as to how like us chimpanzees actually are. We didn't know back then that the DNA of humans and chimpanzees differs by only just over 1%. We didn't know how similar was the immune system, the composition of the blood, the anatomy of the brain. We didn't know those things. And so it was, for me, of course, the behavior that interested me, the fact that their non-verbal communication patterns include kissing, hugging, patting, holding hands, if you're a little bit aggressive and trying to improve your rank, you may swagger with your hair bristling. We all know human males who swagger. And it was unfortunate and shocking to me to find that chimpanzees, whom I thought were nicer than us, also have a dark side to their nature. They're capable of violence, brutality, and even a kind of primitive war. And the males of the community, who remain in the community for life, bond, and they jointly patrol the boundaries of a territory. And if they see neighbors from a neighboring community, will likely give chase and attack, and the victim is likely to die of wounds inflicted. Not so aggressive within the community, but the inter-community aggression is very shocking. Like us, they also can show love, compassion, and altruism. As when a 12-year-old male, who's a bit like a 15-year-old human, he adopted a 3-year-old infant who'd lost his mother. If he'd had an older brother or sister, he would have been adopted, because that's what happens. But little Mel was all alone in the world. And we didn't even think he would survive, because at 3 years old, you're still suckling, you're still sleeping with your mother at night, but you're just about able to make do on solid foods. But the support of a mother, the affection, the closeness, the riding on her back, that's really important for a young chimpanzee infant. To our amazement, this young male spindle, who wasn't even related, genetically he wasn't related to Mel's family, but he adopted little Mel. He let Mel ride around on his back. He let Mel cling to his belly if it was raining or Mel was scared. If Mel climbed up to his nest at night, Spindle reached out and drew him in, and they slept curled up together. And most impressive, if Mel got too close to socially aroused males who are competing for this dominant status with their charging displays, when they hurtle across the ground, stamping and slapping and hurling rocks and leaping up and swaying branches. And if an infant gets in the way, that infant may be picked up and thrown. It seems as though the males aren't really conscious of the fact that it's an infant. It's so worked up, they grab anything. The mother's job is to keep the infant away. And Spindle took on that role, even though this meant he sometimes got beaten up himself, because adolescent males normally keep well out of the way of socially aroused adult males. And so there's no question Spindle saved Mel's life. Well, it's pretty clear that there isn't a sharp line, after all, dividing us from the rest of the animal kingdom. When I'd been in Gombe about a couple of years, I got a letter from Louis Leakey saying that I would have to find money for myself when he was no longer around, and to do that I should have to get a degree, and there was no time to mess about with a BA or an MA. I would have to go straight for a PhD, which you may think is great, but it wasn't, because I felt that I was resented by the other students. Who was I to come in to Cambridge University without having done all that prior work? And so I felt uneasy, but even worse, the professors, of whom I was a little scared, told me I'd done everything wrong. I shouldn't have given the chimpanzees names. That wasn't scientific at all. They should have had numbers. I couldn't talk about chimpanzees having personalities, minds capable of something like thinking, and absolutely not emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, despair, grief, and so on. Because, why? Because those were unique to us. But fortunately, all through my childhood, I had a fantastic teacher. A teacher who taught me quite definitely those professors are wrong. And that teacher was my dog, Rusty. You actually can't share your life in a meaningful way. The dog, a cat, a rabbit, a horse, I don't care what it is, and not know the professors were wrong. But I was fortunate in having an amazing supervisor. At first he was my greatest critic, but then he came to Gombe And he said he learned more in 2 weeks there than everything else he learned in his life about animal behavior. So he became the one who helped me to write about my findings in such a way that I wasn't torn apart by scientific colleagues. Robert Hyde, an amazing man. And I'll just give, in case it's useful to some of you, I'll give you an example of the kind of way he told me to write, because it stood me in good stead all through my whole career. I had written in my naive way that after Flo had a new baby, 5-year-old Fifi, that's the normal birth spacing, she was fascinated by this baby. She stayed close to her mother. She was always wanting to touch and to groom. And if any other youngster came near, Fifi's hair would bristle and she'd chase the youngster away. And I'd written she was jealous. Robert Hine said, but Jane, you can't say that. You can't prove it. I said, well, no, I can't, but I'm sure she was jealous. So what should I say? And he said, I suggest you say, Fifi behaved in such a way that had she been a human child, we would say she was jealous. That was really clever. Remember it. You cannot argue with that statement. But anyway, I got my PhD, and I was able to go back to Gombe, build up a research station, and learn more and more. We're still doing the chimp studies on the same community. We're in our 55th year. But I want to just spend a few moments on thinking about what I was told back then, that the difference between us and the other animals was one of kind. It's obviously one of degree. And so what the chimpanzees did, they enabled me to kind of widen the view of science. That after all, we are part of and not separated from the rest of the animal kingdom. And we now know, because science is broadening its outlook, about other amazing things. I mean, for years, science in its arrogance said that birds couldn't possibly do the sort of things that mammals did because their brain was structured differently. So when parrot owners said, my parrot understands the words he says and says them in the right context, scientists would say, that's not possible. Until, at Oxford University, the scientists studying crows, they gave them a simple task, a glass tube with a food reward at the bottom and a piece of wire with a hook. It was easy for the crows to use that wire to pull out the food reward, until one day, accidentally, the hook broke off. So a lot of frustration, until one bird took beak and claw and bent a hook, got the food out. So scientists, many of them said, well, that was just a chance, you know, it just happened by mistake. Well, the next day, even if it had been chance, the bird had learned and immediately made a hook. And this went on. Bird makes hook, bird gets reward. Oh, but said the scientists, well, yes, but it's just one of the birds, it's just an aberrant bird. You can't produce anything from that. So why was just one bird getting the food reward? Because that was the female, and every time she got the reward, her husband took it away. She was his tool. He didn't need to mess about with bits of wire. So now there's a flurry of interest in bird mentation, bird intelligence. And what about the octopus? The octopus doesn't even have a brain per se. It's got a collection of a central nervous system, ganglions. And yet, we now find the octopus is amazingly intelligent. It can recognize people, work out how to open a tank and get into a neighboring tank and steal fish, can open puzzle boxes to get out food rewards. They are amazing, absolutely amazing. So everybody is now working on octopus and crustacean intelligence. Anyway, that's the way it is today. We even know that trees can send out messages. They send out chemical messages. So if you're a tree and you're attacked by a plague of caterpillars, you send out these chemical messages, and other nearby trees immediately put extra toxin into their leaves so they can better withstand the onslaught when the caterpillars arrive in their branches. So much to learn. I think you young people growing up now who want to do anything in this field are so lucky because there is so much to learn. It's out there. The box of science is huge now, and you've got permission to go and study the things I could not have studied because science said they didn't exist. And now science is proving and finding ways to prove that personality and emotion and so forth actually do exist and can be studied because we have different tools. Why did I leave Gombe? It was my dream place. I left Gombe because at a big conference in America, we brought together all the different people studying chimpanzees from across Africa, and some studying in captive situations, non-invasive. And we had a session on conservation that was shocking. Everywhere where chimpanzees were then being studied across Africa, the forests were being destroyed, it was the beginning of the bushmeat trade, that's the commercial hunting of wild animals for food. And so the chimpanzee numbers were dropping fast, they were being caught in the wire snares set by hunters to catch antelopes and so forth to eat. And we also had a session on conditions in captive situations like medical research. Closest living relatives filmed secretly in 5-foot by 5-foot cages, having been there for 30 years. They can live to be more than 60. There because they're so like us in their bodies that scientists could search for cures and vaccines for otherwise uniquely human diseases, but not prepared to admit that they had really striking similarities in their intellect and their emotions. So I went to that conference as a scientist, planning to continue my wonderful life of being out in the forest, working with the students, doing some teaching at Stanford University, time to write up and analyze the data, which I love, and also write some popular books. And I left as an activist, and since then I haven't been more than 3 weeks in any one place. So, as I was traveling around, it was initially in Africa, to the range countries, trying to see who I could meet, trying to bring together the NGOs on the ground so that they began working together. Because very often NGOs are so separate, and yet if you combine forces, you can do so much more. And fortunately, because of National Geographic, the story of Jane and the chimps, you know, Beauty and the Beast, and all around the world. And even heads of state in Africa knew who I was, so often I could get to see them and talk about conservation and logging and things like that. So it was as I was going around Africa talking about these things that I realized that so many of Africa's problems were pretty grim. So much poverty, so much hunger, so much disease, so much ethnic violence. And that so much of this, not all of it, but so much of it was left over from the old colonial days when arrogant people went in from other countries and took the natural resources for their own purposes and typically left the Africans poorer or enslaved them. And today, to some extent, some major corporations are acting the same way, taking the natural resources, leaving most Africans poorer, displacing them from their land for our kind of monoculture farms, and it's just some of the wealthy who stash money away in Swiss bank accounts. So I thought, well, I take this message to Europe and to North America, and then increasingly to Asia, Latin America, and now the Middle East. And while I'm talking about the plight of the planet, I mean, you all know about it, I'm sure, but as I'm traveling around, I'm learning more and more about what we're doing to this beautiful planet. The deforestation, the spread of the desert, the shrinking water supplies, the loss of biodiversity, the reckless burning of fossil fuels, the pollution, agricultural and industrial and household, that's polluting the air, the land being washed down into the rivers, the streams, and into the ocean. The forests, particularly the tropical rainforests, as you know, I'm sure you all know, they sequester carbon dioxide, taking it from the atmosphere. And this CO2 is also stored not only in the leaves of the trees, but the forest soils. And as the forests are cut down, the CO2 is released into the atmosphere, and it's the main ingredient of these greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gases that are forming a blanket around our planet. We need some of them. They trap the warmth of the sun. And if we had no greenhouse gases, there would be no life. We'd be a piece of bare, icy rock like the moon. But we're trapping too much because of all of our reckless burning of fossil fuels and destruction of rainforests and so on. And the other ecosystem that sequesters CO2 is the ocean. And as oceans become increasingly polluted, so there are these dead zones, and there the CO2 can no longer be absorbed. And so we all know about climate change now. Almost everybody has admitted to the fact that the world's climate is changing. And for me, traveling as I do all around the world, I see it. Everywhere I go, people say, well, the weather's very weird this year. It isn't normally like this. The floods are worse, the droughts are worse, the summers are hotter, the winters are colder. Sometimes the summer is cold and the winter is hot. It's just a mess. And so, isn't it peculiar? It's time now to say, but we're different from the other animals. I've said we're so like chimps and we're part of the animal kingdom, yes. But the big difference to me is the explosive development of the human intellect. And, you know, chimps are way more intelligent than we used to think. They can learn 400 or more of the signs of American Sign Language and use them to communicate with each other as well as their teacher. But you can't compare that brain, however amazing it may seem to us, with the brain that created a rocket that went up to Mars, released a little robot that crawled around taking photographs of the surface of the red planet. We've only got planet Earth. And how come that this most intellectual creature is destroying its only home? The photographs from Mars make it pretty clear that that is not an option. We do not want to go and colonize Mars, Venus, Mercury, too hot. We've just got planet Earth. So what's gone wrong? How is this intellectual creature destroying the planet? And what seems to have happened is a disconnect between this clever brain and the human heart. And that's in the poetic sense, love and compassion. And so where people used to make a big decision only after asking themselves, how will this affect their future? How will this affect our people in the future? We don't do that so often now. How will this decision I make today affect me now? Or how will it affect the next shareholders meeting? Or how will it affect my next political campaign or my next job interview, that sort of thing. And so there seems to be this disconnect between the brain and the heart. And I truly believe that only when we learn to live with head and heart in harmony can we achieve our true human potential. And our true human potential is huge. So as I'm traveling around the planet, I kept and keep meeting young people your age especially, some high school students, some people out in their first jobs who don't seem to have much hope for the future. And some of you may feel like that, because you look around at what's happening in the world and it's grim. It's not just the destruction of the environment, it's the poverty, the unsustainable lifestyles, the increasing human population. It's a mess. And so, meeting these young people, most of them just apathetic, not seeming to care much. A lot of them deeply depressed, some angry, even violent. When I began talking to them, they all said more or less the same. We feel like this because we feel that you're compromising our future, that you have compromised our future, and there's nothing we can do about it. Every day I see small children. Every day I feel shame at how we've harmed the planet since I was that age. Shame, anger, depression sometimes. But is it too late? Is there nothing we can do? This is where I firmly believe we still have a window of time, but it's not huge. I firmly believe that if we get together and use this intellect that we've been blessed with, we can find a way out. And it's not just the intellect leading to technologies like green energy. That's very important. But it's also an intellect that says, what about your life? The main message of the program that I began for young people, that I want to tell you about, is that every single one of us makes a difference every single day. The Roots and Shoots program began in Tanzania 25 years ago. It began with 12 high school students who gathered on my veranda and were talking about what they felt was wrong in their own environment. Like, why isn't the government doing more to prosecute the poachers killing our animals in our national parks? Why isn't the government prosecuting the people who dynamite the coral reefs to catch fish more easily? Why is there no environmental education in our schools? Why is nobody paying attention to the street children who are sniffing glue? They had all their different problems. Who's doing something about the stray dogs? Or the cruel conditions to animals in the markets? Would I do something about it all? I said, well, you know, I love Tanzania, but I'm not Tanzanian. But maybe we can work out how you can do something. These were 17, 18, 19-year-old young men and women, mostly men. So they went and found their friends who felt much the same. They came from 9 different schools. We had a meeting, and we decided to form this series of clubs where young people could take action. It wasn't so easy back then. It was still a bit communistic in Tanzania, but there's ways around that. And so from the beginning, it was going to be every group between them will choose themselves 3 different kinds of project. One to make things better for people, one to make things better for other animals, and one to make things better for the environment. And running through it would be a theme of, let's learn to live in peace and harmony with each other, between religions, between cultures, between old and young, rich and poor, between nations, and between us and the natural world. And so what began back then with these 12 high school students and then their friends is now in 138 countries. We've got about 150,000 groups, and a group can be a whole school. And we've got members, kindergarten, a few preschoolers, and then all the way up, and very strong in university. Very strong in university. I think the reason it's growing so fast is because it's youth-driven, it's empowering young people, it's listening to your voices, and empowering you to take action. Roots and Shoots is about action, not about sitting in class and learning about all these problems. It's about sitting around in groups and using this incredible ability we have to use words to discuss, so that people from different walks of life can get together and together bring in their own particular expertise to solve a problem. And so the groups sit around and discuss the problems, and obviously that gets more important as you get older. The little ones have to have some guidance and some help, but even little children know if they want to help animals or people or the environment. And so, as I say, the reason it's growing is because it's youth-driven, because you get to choose what you want to try and do something about, and then you're much more likely to roll up your sleeves and actually get to work and do something. That's what Roots and Shoots is all about. And people often say, oh, young people can change the world. Worse than that, I've heard people talk to a group like you and say, it's your responsibility. It's going to be your world tomorrow. It's up to you to make a difference. That's not true. It's up to us, not you. We've created this world. What it is up to you is to try and use your energy and your commitment and your concern to do something about it. Not your responsibility. But if you want the world to be a better place, you're going to have to play a part in clearing up the mess that we have made. And we have to take responsibility for having made that mess. I could tell you hundreds and hundreds of stories about Roots and Shoots, and I don't think there's time because you need to ask questions. But my reasons for hope, the reason I believe we have this window of time all, it's the young people all around the world. I know what they're doing. Secondly, it's this brain. I know what we're capable of doing. I know what's out there. Unfortunately, there are vested interests of major corporations that don't want to see clean, green energy because they want to go on selling oil and gas. And no, there are corporations that don't want alternatives to palm oil because they want to go on destroying the forests and having palm oil plantations, and so on. But nevertheless, the brain is coming up with amazing technology, and we are learning to lead lives that are more in harmony with nature. And then there's the resilience of nature, a place that we've totally destroyed. Give it some time, and nature can reassert herself, maybe not exactly as before, but a place which is once again beautiful and can support life. Animals can be rescued from the very brink of extinction and given another chance, providing we can save the environment for them. And finally, this indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle seemingly impossible tasks and won't give up, and blaze a trail for others to follow and sometimes succeed themselves, and they're in all walks of life. And I'm telling you, every single one of you in here, everyone has an indomitable human spirit. Just let it out. Just let it out, and you're capable of changing the world a lot more than you think right now. It just occurred to me the other day when I was taking part in the climate march in New York last September, that another reason for hope, which I never thought of before, is social media. It's another example of intellect with clever use of technology. But on that climate march, the organizers hoped that maybe there'd be 100,000 people. There were nearly 400,000. The police had to stop it. Why? Yeah, I watched, I was there. I saw everybody on their little iPads and cell phones, tweeting and twittering and going on to Facebook. Come and join us. You know, it's neat. Whatever his name is, De Niro is over there, and Al Gore's over here, and oh, Jane Goodall's here too. And I saw the people coming. And so these are my great reasons for hope. And we're tied up in this materialistic lifestyle. And it's very hard because as soon as we have an economic crisis, the economists say, well, you've got to go and buy more stuff, because that's supporting your country and boosting, boosting development and boosting the economy. And so we go on buying, we buy stuff that we don't need, stuff that we don't want, instead of just buying stuff that we need. And if we buy stuff we need, then we're told that, oh, we're destroying jobs for somebody in the third world. Okay, so it is going to be your world, you are moving into it. These are the problems we have to solve. And it's no good just saying, well, it's always going to be the same because if it's always the same, it'll be the end of life as we know it. I don't want my great-grandchildren to grow up in a world like that. So we have to get together, the old and the young, the different nations, and try and solve the problems one by one, and never say that we can't do it. Just simply say, we must do it, and therefore we will use our collective brains to make it happen, because we can, because we must. So that's the message I have for you this morning, and I hope there's time for some questions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I shall now open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand if you have any questions, and our staff will be handing a mic to you. Can we have someone to pass the mic to the gentleman over there?
Okay, do I need to introduce myself first?
Just your name and organization.
I'm Jen, I'm from NUS. Okay, I want to ask, right, if you're familiar with the new generation. Here.
Please stand up.
Okay. I would like to ask, right, if you're familiar with the new generation of science, which is that everything, even humans, will now be reduced to numbers. Okay. I don't know how familiar with game theory or computer science, and what we do, right, even in medicine, right, what we do is that, sure, you all have individual names, but what we do in the end is that when we present our research paper, everything becomes a number. Right? So the point I want to make is this one. Is the idea of intertwining science with emotions, this sort of discrediting the science that this kind of science that we do. Yeah.
No, I don't think it discredits it, but sometimes you may think, maybe I could have done the science in a different way or presented it in a different way. And some science has definitely should never have been done. There's some animal experimentation should never ever have been allowed to be done. It's because people talk about animals as mere things, mere objects. And the tragedy is that we think of ourselves sometimes in that way. So when you take the Nazis and what they did to the Jews in the concentration camps, they were all given numbers. They were treated like you treat chimpanzees in medical research. And when people say, well, you can't compare the humans with the chimpanzees, the most powerful writing about animals in medical research has been written by Holocaust survivors, because they know how terrible it is. So it isn't that we're discrediting science, mostly, although sometimes, maybe, we say it shouldn't have been done, if it's very harmful.
Due to time constraint, I think we'll have one last question. I think a mic for the gentleman over here.
This year is the 70th year after the end of the Second World War. The world is still at war, big or small. Europe has learned not to start a Third World War. At least it's living in peace, relative peace. Having looked at the closest being to man, what can we learn from the art of making peace from chimpanzees? They are very territorial. I've read Dr. Goodall, your beautiful book, Through Looking Glass. They can be very genocidal. Have you thought of how to observe them making peace and perhaps glean some lessons? There's no point caning them. Maybe the use of shaming might do the trick.
Well, certainly we find within the chimpanzee community they're really good at reconciliation, better than us. So that if there's a quarrel, the lower ranking is not relaxed until the higher ranking has responded to a gesture like a reached out hand, and then the top ranking one will usually pat the hand or give an embrace, and harmony is restored. But I think what we learn from the chimpanzees, I don't think shame comes into it. What we learn is that Louis Leakey believed there was an ape-like human-like creature, a common ancestor, about 7 million years ago. And that from that common ancestor, chimpanzees evolved that way and we evolved this way. And he was, digging up the fossils of early man. And he thought, well, if this behavior, if Jane finds behavior that's similar or the same in chimpanzees today and humans today, possibly that was brought by both sides from that common ancestor. And therefore, he could imagine that his early humans were showing these behaviors that we share with chimps. And one of these behaviors is aggression and war. So yes, probably we have inherited aggressive traits. But that doesn't mean that war is inevitable, because we have this superior intellect, and we find that mostly people don't go around acting the way they feel. It's only the hooligans who go around, the gang members, that go around acting the way they feel. Most of us can feel really mad and angry, and you know, our language says that I could kill her, I could murder him, but mostly we don't do that. And we learn to control our basic biological behavior. And this trouble is that war, the war that we see, the big wars, it's not really to do with this kind of emotional response to aggression. It's money. Money, money, money. Money, they say money is the root of all evil. And money is the root of an awful lot of evil, but let's realize that, you know, if you make a lot of money, it can be used for very evil purposes, and often is. But also, we need people with lots and lots of money to help us do good in the world. And a lot of money can help us to do a lot of good. So I'm always looking for people with a lot of money. Grow roots and shoots. Grow a community of young people around the world who understand, yes, we need money to live a good while we live for money in and of itself.
Ladies and gentlemen, we thank Dr. Jane for joining us today. We would like to invite Mr. Ruskin Ong, President of NTU, on stage to present 2 tokens of appreciation to Dr. Jane. Mr. Ruskin Ong, please.